The Lord bless you from wherever and whichever part of the world you're connecting. From all the food soldiers, it's another time for us to really look at this subject that is of utmost importance, because as times are changing, we must also be able to adapt to what is changing so that we are not left behind. Full-time ministry or full-time. We'll begin, as my tradition is, with prayer today before we begin to talk about this extensively. Precious Lord, we thank you for today. We bless your name. We give you all the glory and all the honor. Thank you for your grace and thank you for your mercy. As we look into this word briefly, I ask that let there be an illumination, let there be an understanding that will help us navigate the realities of today's ministry. Blessed be your name, Father, in the name and nature of the universal Christ. Amen. Full-time ministry or full-time ministry is what I'm looking at. And next week I will continue with my series on church culture. But let's look at this very briefly. How did we even come across with the concept of full-time ministry? Now, if you look at the caption on my topic, full, that's F-U-L, double L, and full, and then we have F-O-O-L, full. How did we come about the concept of full-time ministry in our changing times and in our changing realities? And those are the things I want to really look at it briefly, because we'll have to come back to it next week. And I promise to go back to our series on church cultures that I started last week. How did we come about with the concept? Now we have to lean back on the Jewish scriptures, because that is one of our greatest resources in terms of navigating spiritual understanding of how the Jews understood ministry to be. And it is very important to note also that the Jews must be thanked, or we must be grateful to the Jews forever, because they were bold enough to communicate what they perceived to be the word of God for them, or what they call the Tanakh, the scriptures, the Torah. And they communicated it and put it down into writing. And one of the objectives of them doing this was because they were kind of a nation that were always a victim of being moved from their place of birth and from their place of nativity. And so they kept moving them from all over the place. And they said, okay, one of the ways that we have to make sure that we maintain our faith heritage, which I have said it initially that Christianity came from the womb of Judaism. All the great prophets we see in the Bible, Prophet Elijah, Elisha, and Abraham, all of them were great pillars of Judaism. And so Christianity, we can say Judaism is the mother of Christianity. It is a fact, because the temple in Jerusalem, the symbol of it was Judaism. And that symbol said there is only one God, and him alone is to be worshipped. You must not have any other God beside me, and all of those things. So our greatest spiritual heritage comes from Judaism. You have to understand that. And so the Jews must be thanked, because they were able to put some of the things we are working on today into writing, and we are learning from that perspective. But even though in a large extent it is tribalistic in nature, but we see that there are still some universal terms and universal truths in this book. And so even from the progression of the Jewish understanding, we see that it was a tribalistic religion. It was a tribalistic understanding, but they began to grow and began to grow and began to grow. And then at a point, Malachi started saying, this thing is not just going to be with us. It's going to be beyond us. And so that has given us a preamble, or like a template, to look at how their understanding was that shaped what ministry is all about. Now, the term full-time ministry came in as a result of that same tradition. Now, in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, there's a scripture there about the children of Israel, Exodus 20 and verse 19, coming to Moses because of the various understanding of Moses at that time, where he will tell the people, go and prepare yourself. The Lord wants to speak to us, and then you'll be hearing thunder and blast of trumpets and so many of it like that. It got to a point where the people became so scared and said, Moses, that's Exodus 20 and verse 19. He said, Moses, we don't want to hear this voice again. We just want you to go listen to this voice and come tell us what the voice is saying. And so that tradition began to shape the understanding of ministry. Because at this point now, we got to wait for someone to go and listen to whatever God was going to say to come tell us. But we see in the encounter of Prophet Elijah that the voice of God was not in the thunder, neither was it in the earthquake, but it came as a still small voice. And if it came as a still small voice, how did Elijah understand that this was the voice of God? That voice came from within his heart. So there was not enough understanding at that time to know that everything about divinity is not external but internal. So that understanding and that organization of Moses, because of how we perceive God to be, you see, God is greater than the greatest. There is no doubt about that. As a matter of fact, God cannot even be defined. Prophet Isaiah was very right when he said, there is no searching of his understanding. You cannot go to a lizard now, for instance, and said lizard should begin to write about how human beings work. It will never understand because it's going to write from the perspective of a lizard. But when they finish writing that and present it to us as human beings, that was it, oh, this is not it. And so God is beyond, God is out of our reach. We cannot even comprehend the thought of God because God is not a man. And so Moses began to have this understanding because of the complexity of his encounters and some of the things that were real to him at that time. Even though we know that in those days we've looked through the archives of the Egyptians and we didn't see anybody with the name Moses. And so the name was adapted from a real person. And a lot of things about it was modified to give us the story that we have today. And so with that understanding in Exodus 20, where the people were afraid because of the blast of trumpet, because of the organization in terms of waiting to hear from the Lord, to them, to their mind, God was sitting in the sky. And today, as astrophysicists will tell you, or physicists will tell you, that there's nobody in the sky living. So to them, they saw the three-tier sky as heaven. And so all of them were waiting, and that's why Moses several times will climb onto the mountain and say, wants to go and receive from the Lord and all. So, but the kind of organization that Moses had about that encounter and that experience brought more fear, and people were so much in fear when these trumpets, when he gave orders for these trumpets and all of these things began to be blown and smoke and all those things that follow, you know. And so with that, since man could not comprehend the complexity of the being called God, and which some people call it universal pure presence, because God was the closest name to be given to it, self-existent and self-sufficient. And that was still an English word. Man had no capacity to put the right things about who God is into pen or into black book. And so that is why most of the time there is a lot of there's a lot of exaggeration, because men were looking for words that were big and complex enough to explain the supernatural scenario. And so with all of this in Exodus 20, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we'll listen, but do not have God speak to us, as we will die. And so that was the thought of the people. And so that was the introduction of a tradition that men had to be designated to hear God on behalf of other men. And I cannot blame them, because that was the understanding at that time. And so Moses too, as a leader who was very sensitive and very wise, had to begin to come up with an organization of what ministry should be all about. And so that was what gave birth to him separating the tribes called the Levite. And the Levites were designated to take care of the things of the temple because of his several experiences. And he said, there's an organization that needs to be set up to make sure that we designate people to do this. And only the Levites were those who were not receiving land portion or inheritance, because their inheritance was the Lord. And so that is where the institution of tithes and offerings came in. That's where the institution of bringing special gift, that was where the institution of several feasts, about 7 different kind of feasts that was instituted. And all of it was instituted with the objective. All of it was instituted with the objective to make sure that those who were in the tabernacle were well taken care of. And this is how that understanding began to come. That there were some people that were designated to be ministers all their lives. And so there was even an age that you must be 30 to be qualified into this office. And then in the law, as Moses began to set it up, and we must also appreciate him for that tradition and the organization, the extent of the organization in construction of the temple. People like Bezalel and all the other architects that were very gifted by wisdom, they began to design this tabernacle. According to Moses, he said he was designing based on the pattern that had been given to him. And so there is a possibility there was some kind of revelation that he had and began to put up this temple and how it should be. But don't forget that what I'm trying to say, the source of all I'm trying to talk about, that made men to arrive at the full-time ministry, came from when man began to ask another man to talk to them on behalf of God and to listen to God on behalf of them and come to tell them what God was saying. That was that understanding that began to grow in that time. And so Moses still had to put an organization together and design the temple, design the priests. And of course, one of the first priests was Aaron, the high priest. And when that organization took place, and the feast also were instituted and all of this is, it was the objective. The objective was to make sure that the men who were serving in the temple were well taken care of. And so in the sacrifice part, there were two things that Moses spoke about that must go to the high priest. That is the breast and the right thigh. And so this breast was the sacrifice that was reserved for the high priest. The right thigh was for the officiating priest. And so with that, Moses came about with an institution that brought out a temple. And this temple, there were protocols in this temple. There were protocols in this tabernacle. When you are coming into this tabernacle, there's what we call the entrance. After the entrance, we have the courtyard, and then from the courtyard we have the main entrance, or the how do I put it now? The entrance, the courtyard, and then we have the brazen laver just at the door. And then when you enter it, you see Moses set up what we call the table of his presence. And in that table, there was bread. And this bread was always 5, was 12, signifying the 12 tribes of Israel. And every week, this bread has to be changed and put brand new breads. And also the organization that Moses set up was well off and ready to begin to run. And that would become a pattern that we're going to follow, because Moses carried in his womb the tabernacle and he gave birth to it. And he was a man like me and you. He had that understanding at that time to set it up and make sure that there were priests who were designated to serve. And so when you come in and enter into the courtyard, that courtyard is a place where there were a lot of sacrifices were brought, and people, they will be sacrificing a sin offering, all manner of offering, maybe child dedication and dedication of the firstborn, and so all manner of the feast of the tabernacle, feast of Pentecost, Shavuot, and so the Passover, and all of this is were instituted. They are all from the Jewish culture, the Jewish tradition of understanding how they should relate with God. And because the understanding was that they have to be a mediator, and Moses was that mediator between him and the people. And so when they set up this house, you come into the courtyard where the priests are doing all the sacrifice and killing all the animal. It flowed with so much blood. And then after the courtyard, we have the brazen laver at the entrance of the temple, of the tabernacle. That brazen laver, there is a water there, and the objective of that water is after you finish killing animals and all the sacrifices, make sure that you wash your hands before you come in. And then when you go in, we have the table of his presence, and that table we have about 7 loaves of bread. We have a candle star, a candlelight stick that was in that same table, and that was what was called the holy place. And in that holy place, we have the table set up, we have the candle, the candlelight standing, and then there's another aspect of that same place we call the Holy of Holies. Now, the Holy of Holies is different from the holy place. The Holy of Holies is a place where only the high priest is permitted to get into it once in every year. And when the high priest is making plans to, or is getting ready to enter into that place, he must make sure that he renders sacrifices for himself first, and then for the sins of the people. And so that was the tradition that we were all caught up. And that is the tradition we all lean on. And because of this organization of Moses and all the things he began to do, but the understanding began to shift. That's where people withdraw the term full-time ministry, because now there were people that don't have any sacrifice, that they don't have any inheritance, which were the Levites. They were designated to make sure that whoever is the high priest, they're given assignment and responsibility to be taken care of. And so when these Levites come, this officiating priest, if it falls in your name, you're the one officiating with Aaron or any other high priest. You are the one responsible in killing all the animals and making all the sacrifices. And they even had something like called the incense, where they believed that the sacrifice goes up to God and God consumed the sacrifice. That was the understanding at that time. And don't forget, this was the full-fledged age of Judaism. And so with the organization of that kind of a ministry pattern, you could say somebody is in full time, because there is a table of the shewbread. There must be bread there. Every week, they has to change the 12 loaves. And when they're about to change it, the 12 loaves that were there, they are not thrown away. They take them into the house of the high priest. And so that was the tradition that we withdraw the term full-time ministry. Because number one, the Levites were not given inheritance. Their inheritance was in the house of the Lord. And as long as the house of the Lord was functioning, people will always commit sin and come for propitiation and come to be forgiven. And so when they are sacrificing these animals, the breast of any kind of sacrifice brought belongs to the high priest. And so imagine 40 people in the day committing sin, and they are coming to the high priest to ask for forgiveness, and they have to provide a ram. At the end of the day, in fact, the kitchen of the high priest will be so full. And there was also an injunction that bring all the tithes. If you are a farmer, whatever you are planting, when you harvested, the best portion of it is reserved for the priest. And so people were doing full time. Don't forget, the understanding was that this man talks to God on my behalf. And so whatever he speaks, I believe that is him hearing from God and telling it to me. But understanding began to shift, because there was a more higher calling than that. In that era, people understood that for them to hear God, they need to hear what God was telling another man who will come to tell them. But the understanding began to shift that no, it's not like that. It was an understanding at that time. The God you want to hear externally is the God that is living on your inside. And so by the time this understanding began to shift, began to do away with that. A lot of people are saying Paul wrote the book of Timothy. Paul didn't write the book of Timothy, because let me explain to you why I said that. Now, the book of Timothy is a letter basically for church administration. When Paul was alive, the pattern of writing in Timothy is not his pattern of writing. Paul was not someone who was thinking that the church should have a structure, it should be organized. He was someone who believed that rapture was coming. It was someone who believed that Jesus is coming to take the church away and everybody should be ready. And that's why in the book of Romans, it said the time is fast spent. So they were always believing. Paul was an apocalyptic preacher. And so when Paul died and the coming of the Lord had not yet been materialized as they believed at that time, some people said, okay, this man have set up so many organizations. This man have set up so many organizations, so many churches in people's houses. How are we going to make sure that we send documents to help the people leading this house fellowship administratively? And that was why the book of Timothy had to come. And it is believed that it was written by one of the followers of Paul. And in those days, there was a tradition that when you are writing, if you want your writing to be accepted, you have to give it to someone who is prominent and has been accepted by a certain organization. And so the letter of Timothy is about the administration and how to set up the church, which is the house of God. And so somebody did that so well on behalf of Paul. And so with that, we saw the understanding of Paul when he said the time is fast spent in the book of Romans. His language was always that there is something that is about to happen. It was apocalyptic. It's like something is going to happen and take everyone from this physical realm. And so since that didn't happen, the book of Timothy had to come. And in the writings of Paul, that understanding began to shift. And that's why you see, Paul didn't even follow that template, because there was a shift in understanding that the God we are talking about, you don't have to hear that God through another man. That God lives in you. That God is you. That God is with you. That God is us. So no need of paying somebody and taking care of somebody to go and wait and listen to what God is going to say and come to tell you. So there was a more excellent way. When that understanding began to be exploded, Paul, if you remember, Paul talked more about Christ than Jesus. Because he was basing all his writings, some of his writings and revelation, based on the revelation of Christ. 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 So there was something about the life of Jesus that exploded in divine revelation. And human beings began to look for ways to explain that. And so when Paul came and began to talk, there's something Paul said. Paul said, when I was a child, I did the things of a child. Now I'm an adult. So most time, if you don't look at it carefully, you don't really understand this thing that Paul said that I'm running with. Was it when he was a child? Is it when he had a limited understanding? Because Paul is coming and said, Christ in you, that's the hope of glory. He was talking about a mystery that was hidden in ages, that nobody knew about it. And he came and said, Jesus. He said, Christ in you, the hope of glory. In the old covenant, there was no such revelation. And so you had to wait for a priest. And if there is a priest designated to do that and he doesn't have any inheritance, then you have to take care of him. And so we could say that the Levites were in full-time ministry, but no longer in this dispensation. Because there is a divine explosion of divine revelation. That God does not need, I don't need to pay anyone to hear that God on my behalf. All I need is to hear that God within the small, still voice that is speaking within me. And so all those organizational structure where priests had to be taken care of and all those things, Paul came up and said, Christ is the end of the law. But the law was important because it was a tutor to lead us to the end of the law, which is the revelation of Christ. So when this revelation became explosive was when Matthew was writing, he said, at the death of Jesus, that the curtain of the temple was torn apart. In other words, there was a symbolism in that look, now we don't have to wait for one high priest who will go into the Holy of Holies once in a year, and he's doing that with fear. Because if he makes any mistake, he can die untimely. But that Christ lives in us, with us and as us. And that is the revelation of Isaiah the prophet, Emmanuel, God with us. And so today, the term full-time ministry, even though there are so many ministers who, despite the realities that is going on today in ministry, they are still clinging to that old pattern. No, there is nothing like full-time ministry. Except you want to be a spiritual fool. And I will continue this next week because I don't want this video to be so long. So today, what is the dynamic that I've shifted? The dynamic that I've shifted is we are no longer waiting for anyone to go and hear God and come and tell us what God said. And then secondly, the Holy of Holies was opened up. And the brother that wrote Hebrew understood this when he said, let us come boldly to the throne of grace. So you don't have to wait for anybody to go there. So in my generation, there is nothing like the Levites, because they were designated due to an understanding of a man at that time. But today we have shifted beyond that. Today, I can hear God for myself. Today, I talk to God and that God lives in me. And so I don't need anyone to do that on my behalf. And then the question that somebody is going to ask me is, what about the government of the church? I'm going to explain that tomorrow. Where does the church come in? And what should preachers that are behind the pulpit taking care of the flock be entitled to? And how should they live their life? I will continue that when we come back next week. The Lord bless you real good. And from all of us here, thank you for watching. We'll see you next week, same time. Bye-bye.